Thank you very much. Thank you for staying after a very, very long day, very stimulating and full of information. So thank you to OQI and the organizers for the invitation to be in this very stimulating symposium and for the opportunity to see both old friends and new friends. My talk was supposed to be sort of like the preamble for this morning's session on concreteness, and therefore the emphasis on the idea of concreteness. I'm not sure what is worse, to be the first or the last, but we will try that. And there will be, obviously, a revisiting of some of the topics that we dealt with this morning, and a little bit of overlap, particularly with Gerardo's presentation. But I think, as you will notice, the conclusions are going in a different direction. The last 20 years have seen an unprecedented surge of Latin American concrete and constructive art in international artistic circuits. Within the broader field of what, for operative reasons, we call in an encompassing manner Latin American art, such an ongoing rise stands out as a phenomenon in and of itself. Literally rescued from near oblivion, the current pervasiveness of this kind of art in exhibitions, private collections, and market circuits in Europe, the United States, and Latin America has evolved into the equivalent of a new canon for modern Latin American art. Indeed, through my curatorial work of the last 25 years, first at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin, and most recently at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, I have had the opportunity to both witness as well as contribute firsthand to this phenomenon. For these reasons, I very much welcome the opportunity to critically revisit this hard-to-circumvent topic in the context of this post-war symposium. However, any consideration of the importance or contributions of these tendencies to 20th century modernism has to begin by taking stock of the conspicuous transformations that have taken place in this area since the 1980s. In considering this phenomenon, it is important to remember that as late as the 1980s, the diverse manifestations of concrete and constructive art that emerged in countries across Latin America, across the Latin American region, had no place in their sites of origin, and least of all in the international mainstream. And that applies even to Lygia Clark, Elio Itisica, who were completely unknown even in Sao Paulo. In the United States, the so-called boom of Latin American art, a market-driven strategy promoted for the most part by the specialized auction houses of Sotheby's and Christie's, was dominated by the figurative production of Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and Fernando Botero, as well as the surrealist-inspired compositions of Wilfredo Lam and Mata. As we know, the exaltation of these artists produced the stereotype of Latin America as the continent of the fantastic and the primitive that many of us have fought so hard to debunk. Compared to the bright colors, lush landscapes, and exotic personages portrayed by the exponents of the fantastic, concrete and constructive tendencies were considered to be cold, rational, and/or formal exploration of issues that, when and if relevant, had already been aptly addressed and/or exhausted by European and North American artists. How can we then explain the fairly dramatic shift from total disregard to the positive embrace and exaltation of these artists and movements on the part of collectors, critics, institutions, and the market? While it is hard to exactly pinpoint the factors leading up to this critical move, one thing remains clear. At the heart of this surge is the rather unusual and to a large extent unprecedented role that private collectors have played in the articulation of this radical and confrontational phenomenon. Through their mission-driven collecting activities, as well as the organization of a scholarly infrastructure to assist their efforts, these individuals, and I'm thinking of Adolfo Lerner in Sao Paulo, Patti Cisneros in Caracas and New York, Ela Fontanals de Cisneros in Miami, as well as many others, these individuals not only stimulated, but forced a reconsideration at the mainstream level of the genuinely significant role played by artists and groups from Latin America in the international development of both concrete and constructive art. From this point of view, and from that time on in what concerns us here, it could be argued that the private collection and not the museum has emerged as the privileged discursive site from which to reconfigure the background and or perception of Latin American concrete and constructive movements, while in the process adjusting the distorted and reductive lens through which Latin American art as a whole has been evaluated. The dynamic synergy between maverick collectors and entrepreneurial curators, in turn, produce a spate of exhibitions and publications in the United States focused on these tendencies. And the list is too long to enumerate here. I will just refer to a few examples. Beginning with geometric abstraction Latin American art from the Patricia Phelps de Cisneros collection at the Fogg Art Museum in Harvard in 2001, an exhibition that really initiated the boom of these types of tendencies in the United States. Two dimensions of constructive art in Brazil, the Adolfo Lerner collection at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2007. And then, of course, these collecting initiatives also were preceded or paralleled by major museum shows, such as Inverted Utopias, the avant-garde art in Latin America, organized by theoretician Hector Olea and myself at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2004, an exhibition that placed these artists and groups in constellatory dialogues with one another, as you can see here from the constellation of progression and rupture that featured, in this case, the Madi group and some of the concretos of Argentina. And of course, Lindsay Levansky's Beyond Geometry, Experiments in Form from the 1940s to 1970s at LAGMA in 2004 also, which illustrated some of the same artists in the context of the international shift towards minimalism. Both individually and as a group, each of these exhibitions set out to critically and timely reposition the different versions of Latin American concrete and constructive abstraction vis-a-vis the canonic narrative of these programmatic trends of 20th century art. Obviously, a predictable corollary of these developments was their immediate impact on the art market. Beginning precisely in 2000, a large number of concrete and constructive works began to invade the galleries and art fairs, thereby satisfying an increasing demand on the part of collectors and institutions and producing a steady and always inevitable rise in prices and demand. The marketplace, again, being the pace setter of the move. As demonstrated by Pinta in London and New York, Miami Basel, Arteba in Buenos Aires, and practically every commercial or promotional event where Latin American art is featured, this process even stimulated the momentum in terms of promotion and growth over the past decade of a specialized niche for galleries and agents dedicated to these artistic modalities. In this regard, however, it is important to note that the problem I'm trying to identify here is not the marketability or increased financial value of this art, that after all is a welcome development after years of historical abandonment, if not oblivion. The most pressing issue to be pondered here, in my view, is the risk that comes with the reification and fetishization of artistic practices that, given their original utopian collectivist aspirations, resisted instrumental manipulation. And in this regard, it is very important to note that an artist like Elio Itisica, for instance, never sold anything in his life except the metaschemas, which he used to survive. But everything else he never sold or not wanting to sell, never was represented by a gallery. And you know, this is right now we're living in a very different situation with regards to Elio's work. More importantly, such fetishism tends to smooth out the rough conceptual edges on art-making paradoxes that characterize these intrinsically experimental movements, turning them instead into mere exercises of style. the evident lack of authenticity of the move is particularly taming the theoretical beast. Does this market-driven cleansing of concrete and constructive tendencies signal that we are confronting a similar phenomenon as the fantastic 3 decades ago? In other words, the artists and visual languages are different, but the same forces and vested interests are at play. The same old song of Latin American decharacterization becoming, again and again, a market-driven jingle. In the rest of this presentation, I would thus like to focus on some of the issues associated with the Latin American concrete art phenomenon that, in my view, beg for a thorough and critical reassessment from today's perspective. Through specific cases linked to my research in this area, I hope to suggest, if only tentatively, the basic coordinates of an expanded framework that may assist us in regauging our current views of these artistic practices beyond strictly local or national parameters. That is, the outstanding risks of innovation at stake went well beyond our region and places its canonical questioning at the kernel of the 20th century art history as an undeniable contribution. First, in a very general context, we need to consider that the end of the Second World War generated radical changes across the globe. The planet was divided in Yalta, Tehran, and Potsdam in areas that encompass from geopolitics to economics, from culture to art. The devastation produced by millions of deaths in Europe, Russia, and Nagasaki, and Hiroshima could only point to an obvious, albeit decisive and meaningful constellation: that of destruction, construction. As in the case of the United States, the Latin American developmentalist momentum ran parallel to the European recovery, from the Latin American increase of exports to the Marshall Plan. Having benefited economically from the Second World War, countries like Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina developed timely national projects of modernization that significantly impacted the cultural sphere through a simultaneous will to be updated and modern. Yet in each case, such an universalizing momentum took place in the midst of an out-of-control industrial and urban growth that accompanied the emergence and consolidation of the middle class in countries with the largest and strongest economies. In this context, as Nicolae Shevchenko, has argued, the need for a systemic organization based on accurate, objective, and specific foci, one of the possible translations of concreteness, was intrinsically part of this developmentalist push. Within its notions of exactness, precision, purity, and even an undeniable minimalism, within it, notions of exactness, precision, purity, and even an undeniable minimalism are indicative of the urge to construct rational modern societies. If in Europe, this project was aimed at correcting the chaos left by the war, in the specific case of Latin America, it became a corrective to the endemic lag and chaos of underdevelopment. Such an overarching tendency towards rational organization, analytical and synthetic insight, far-sighted cognitive approaches is what I identify as the necessity of concreteness. It should be noted that this phenomenon also took place here in Europe, where the emergence of a post-war concrete art movement led by Max Bill and his followers reset the stage for a resurgence of aesthetic rationalism, from Russian constructivism to the Bauhaus, from geometry to mathematics. The apex of optimism generated by the economic boom and consequent developmental push, emblematically captured by the establishment of iron and steel industries in Monterrey and Monclova in Mexico, as well as in Volta Redonda and Votorantim in Brazil, as well as automobile plants throughout the region, not only propelled the search for universal languages and a means of global expression, but also inspired the hope that these countries could finally claim their deserved place on the worldwide stage, This is a longing that has been present in Latin American art from the beginning, and that was very pervasive throughout all of the 20th century. It was present in most of the major countries. It was the longing to be accepted at the same level in the worldwide communion of nations. Moreover, in the cultural realm, the establishment of the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1951, the construction of Brasilia, and the Ciudad Universitaria in Caracas stand as emblems of the utopian thrust of that decade. In addition to the concrete poetry movement that positioned Brazil at the same level of experimental innovation as Germany and Japan, there were also unsuspected developments, which Gerardo has also mentioned, in areas such as industrial and graphic design, all of which provided nurturing grounds for what can be termed the concrete sensibility. Specifically in Brazil, such circumstances inaugurated a new era of self-confidence, one marked by what the highly influential critic Mario Pedrosa, following the caustic insights of Oswald de Andrade, the theoretical mind of Semana of 1922, considered the inevitable fate of a young country like theirs. And I quote, "Brazil is a country doomed to be modern," end of quote. As a result of these political and socio-economic events, countries like Brazil and Argentina experienced a transcendental echo of these ideas in the artistic sphere. Beginning with MADI and Arte Concreto Invención in Buenos Aires, and extending to the Ruptura Manifesto and Group, the Frente and Concrete and Neo-Concrete groups in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, the assimilation, ad lib, it must be underscored, of these concepts led to radical questionings and new contributions to the European parameters of concrete art. The coherence and also strength of these movements, however, has tended to project the idea that they were the canon of concrete art manifestations, leading to followers struggling for internal hegemonies in the continent. In this regard, and in spite of this final relevance, it is timely to point out, as we did this morning, and I was very glad for the different papers that illuminated different aspects of this movement, it is timely to point out that there were indeed concrete art manifestations in countries like Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Cuba, as well as in Uruguay, where artists, independent artists like Maria Freire and Tomás Llorens, engage concrete and constructive art from perspectives outside the more rigid parameters of Torres Garcia's constructive universalism. These concrete manifestations even extended to photography, where a nearly forgotten generation of artists engaged in experiments with abstract forms. And we have to be grateful to the Ela Fontanals de Cisneros collection for having collected a very, very large suite of these photographs that present a fascinating examples of this modality, and that serve as comparisons with what the painters and sculptors were doing at the time. More importantly, to this expanded roster must be added numerous cases of artists who operated from inside the metropolis while serving as bridges for the translation of central paradigms to their countries of origin. Amongst these, we can cite the Argentinians Carmelo Ardenquin and Yula Kosice working in Paris, as well as the Colombians Ramirez Villamizar, Eduardo Ramirez Villamizar, and Edgar Negret, who not only worked closely with the so-called cool abstractionists of New York that included Younger Man, Nevelson, Kelly, as well as a number of other artists from this period. They not only worked closely with them, but had a decisive impact in the postulation of the theoretical and artistic positions of this North American group. And then, of course, they went back to Colombia, where they imported this form of concrete and constructive art and became the first exponents of that form, leading to other artists who joined their ranks. The fact that the eruption of the concrete impact did not follow the exhausted center-periphery axis speaks to a kind of innovative participation that negates any trace of dependency erasing once and for all the stigma of being classified as derivative. On the contrary, it underscores the open and dynamic circulation of concepts about the necessity to implement concreteness in the readings and approaches to art on both sides of the Atlantic. This situation leads me to underscore one of the key points that serve to ground this presentation. I refer to the notion of the transnational, that is, a historic and experiential context that points to the existence during this period of multiple centers or networks for the articulation and exchange of the avant-garde, of avant-garde principles, and in this case, concrete art principles. Also very important to point out is the fact that many of the artists who in Venezuela, Brazil, or Argentina engage in these forms of art were themselves émigré artists from Western or Eastern Europe. And that sort of like background knowledge provided one of the first stimuli for their connection to concrete art tendencies. We have the specific case of Gegel coming from Germany, trained in the tradition of the Bauhaus. We have Gerd Leufert, who became her husband. We have Vladislav, we have Samson Flexer in Brazil, Gyula Kosice in Argentina. So that is a history that has really not been approached at all. At the same time, such a transnational network operated on the basis of what I would like to call, in Spanish the term is bisagras, which means it's like an artistic hinge that opens both ways. You know, it has the possibility to function on two different kinds of spaces. So it's a bisagra or an artistic hinge. By that I mean key agents of a specific conception of art that in terms of its originality was relevant for both sides of the avant-garde, or in this case, the concrete equation. In this regard, the cases of concrete art pioneers, Joaquin Torres Garcia and Max Bill, serve to both anchor and illustrate this point. Torres Garcia spent his life between Europe, specifically Spain, France, Italy, and a short period in New York. And I should backtrack and say that he was originally from Montevideo, for those of you who may not know that. He was from Montevideo, he migrated to Spain, then spent times in France, Italy, and a short period in New York. And then in 1934, returned to Latin America and Montevideo, contributing to important developments on both sides of the Atlantic through a vast production that combines elements of surrealism, data, and concrete and constructive art, a fact that makes his work extremely difficult to classify in any one tendency or movement. And this is also part of the problem with many of the artists who engage these tendencies. They are, up until today, very hard to classify in any one of these positions. His productive dialogues in Paris with Piet Mondrian, Theo van Desburg, and the artists of Abstraction Création, which was the group that he established with Michel Sufort in 1930, led to the formulation of a sui generis approach to abstract art that he coined constructive universalism. It is undeniable today that his return to Montevideo in 1934 established a productive bridge between the European and Latin American concrete and constructive avant-garde. Torres Garcia not only imported the idea of concrete art to Uruguay, albeit was a decisive influence in the River Plate for the formulation of some of the most radical postulates of the Argentinian Madi group. And the work that I'm showing from the collection of my museum is emblematic of this, because it is these kinds of maderas, and I'm going to return to that point, these kinds of maderas that Torres Garcia uses as a kind of laboratory to experiment with his ideas about abstraction. This particular madera was produced in 1929, which is exactly the year that he meets Mondrian, and it's a year when they initiate a series of conversations and debates. And it is Torres Garcia working through the ideas of neoplasticism as well as his contact with Van Desburg. And it is this kind of work that stimulates the Carmelo Ardenquin and Gyula Kosice and Rod Rothfuss in the direction of the shaped canvas, or the cut-out canvas as they refer to it. Max Bill fulfills a similar function, yet in the opposite direction. Already an established artist, albeit with a stalled career in Europe, Bill finds a decisive stimulus in the first Sao Paulo Biennial that not only awarded him a prize for his cultured tripartite unity of 1948, but established his version of the concrete art canon in American soil, clean and sharp, suggesting the inner is tantamount to the outer of a Möbius strip. And of course, as it was recounted this morning, Bill is first contacted by Tomás Maldonado in 1948, who visits him in Switzerland. And at that time, in 1949, Lina Bobardi establishes also contact with him. Since 1948, he's involved with the Argentinian artist and then with the Brazilian artist. And of course, one thing leads to the other until he's consecrated, as Gerardo mentioned, in Brazil and Argentina, and his career really acquires what we call in English a second wind, because at the time in Europe, his version of concrete art was just one more version of other abstract art manifestations. And so it is really Brazil and Argentina that provide, the second stimulus for his career. And in this sense, I'm trying to draw a parallel with Torres Garcia. I think he can also function in this sense of a hinge, but on the opposite direction. The historical and political conditions of Latin American countries in the post-war period that I outlined above function to mold concrete art movements into heterogeneous versions, inversions, or subversions, as Hector Olea suggested in his discussion of cases in which the artist as theoretician becomes a mark of their artistic practices. And so they become versions, inversions, or subversions of the original model outlined by Van Desburg's Concrete Art Manifesto and later elaborated by Max Bill. The manifesto spelled out a fairly dogmatic credo for concrete art based on the principles of universality, rationalism, and self-referentiality. These principles would manifest themselves in terms of visual precision and clarity, as well as the complete annihilation of the factual or organic world. As illustrated by Torres Garcia's Construction with Superimposed Rods of 1930, a work that summarizes his debates about the meaning of the concrete and the real, as well as the nexus between nature and abstraction. It is precisely this last aspect that proved so difficult for Latin American artists to renounce. At the core of the very idea of concreteness espoused by these groups, there is an inherent grasp of abstraction, whether geometric or not, imbued with traces of the natural world. It is indeed this contradiction that serves as the starting point, in my view, for the so-called originality of the Latin American proposals. And here I'm showing Tomás Maldonado's Sin Título of 1945, that for those of you who may not be familiar with the source of this, he's really appropriating Malievich's Boy with a Knapsack, color masses in the fourth dimension. And he's doing it in a way in which he's using collage elements for the form. So he's kind of adding kind of a movement and texture, to the work. And he's also encasing it within this cut-out frame, which became the hallmark of the Grupo Madí in Argentina, as well as the Concreto Invencionistas, of which Maldonado is the leader. In this way, he is appropriating a work from Malievich. But he's not just doing it in a completely derivative way. He's basically rethinking the constitution of that work, the relationship between the form and the background, as well as creating a work that is contained in and of itself, because of this cutout frame. In order to illustrate this critical point of my argument, I will discuss several cases that stand out for their operative consciousness, both in theory as well as in practice, of the implications and unfolding of paradoxes as such for a sui generis idea of the concrete. To the extent that up until the 1950s, countries like Brazil, Argentina, or Uruguay had not generated solid precedents for the organic development of non-objective art tendencies, the very notion of the concrete or even constructive art, via Max Bill or not, was still an incontestable, misplaced idea at play. It was imported, adopted, and subject to manifold readjustments and adaptations. From this vantage point, both the Argentinian MADI and Arte Concreto Invención groups, as well as Brazilian concretismo and neoconcretismo, are but aspects of the same phenomenon. An artistic will aimed at liberating art from the yokes of nationalist atavism, unyielding cultural dependency, and the imposition of foreign influences. At the political level, the consolidation of this impulse was the result of the accelerated transition from agrarian to industrial and immediately to mass consumer societies, set in motion mainly by the ideology of 1950s developmentalism and its project of paving the way for an urban, cosmopolitan identity for these countries. As Mario Pedrosa observed, both concrete abstraction and constructive art trends could function as powerful stimuli for young, exuberant, and undisciplined countries such as Brazil. And it is important to remember that at one particular point in the early 60s, when Alfred Barr first visits the Sao Paulo Biennial, he's struck by the fact that whereas everywhere else in the world, artists were going towards informalism and other forms of abstraction, in Brazil, artists were still doing concrete art. And he raised that concern, to which Mario Pedrosa developed a very, very scathing riposte, because it was determined by critics like Pedrosa and Ferreira Goulart that concrete art was the way out for Brazilian art. That was a programmatic almost mandate that was discussed among artists, but that for them it was really the way to the future. And once they started in that project, they did not want to turn back. You know, they had to go on from there to other things. Of course, that situation changed very radically in the 60s, as I will refer to later. Because of his pioneering role in the debates that concerned concrete art in Paris in the late 20s and early 30s, I will begin by returning to the case of Torres Garcia. The concrete phase of his work is best exemplified by the idiosyncratic wood constructions, or maderas, that he produced for the most part during the 6 critical years he spent in Paris between 1926 and 1932, and that, in my view, constitute some of his most important contributions to avant-garde issues of the period. He did about 175 of these maderas, and they have there's like a different evolution in terms of the visual language. They go from very rough ones to some that are imbued with primitivism, and others that are directly involved with all of this debate with neoplasticism and concrete art. In maderas such as Form in Sienna and Black of 1932, Torres Garcia departed significantly from the slick surfaces and use of industrial materials of other concrete art exponents. Instead, he used quite humble materials, nails, paint, and recycled wood from fruit and vegetable crates, without ever trying to hide neither their natural properties, such as texture, chance, and incompleteness, nor the presence of the artist's hand. Furthermore, the work prominently features an unpainted piece of timber on its surface that works as a critical element. It cuts out into space, making the madera a far more complex and unclassifiable form, poised between sculpture and painting. The timber thus represents Torres Garcia's resolution to the endless debates between nature and abstraction. It is an element that is at once incontrovertibly real and completely abstract. Such an interplay of simultaneous oppositions as a modus operandi not only constitutes the best example of the Uruguayan artist's in-between stance, but also explains the significant influence he exerted on the concrete artists of the River Plate. The second case refers us to the Brazilian Concretismo, a loose organization of artists that coalesced in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro around 1952, stimulated by Max Bill's exhibition at the first Sao Paulo Biennial in 1951. The pared-down production of this group has become emblematic of the concrete and constructive surge that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation. It is important to clarify in relation to one of Gerardo's points this morning that all of the artists, whether from Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, they were all part of the same concretista group in the beginning, including Lydia Clark, and to a certain degree, Elio, who was younger at the time. But they all constituted a group, and they themselves did not see the division between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. It was the critics who imposed that division, because in Brazil there is a very ancient feud between both cities. And so even until today, if you invite critics from Sao Paulo and critics from Rio de Janeiro, they're going to sit in opposite sides, and they're not going to talk to each other. We had that experience in Houston. So that's a very ingrained bias in art historiography in Brazil that needs to be taken into account, because it really permeates much of the frameworks and the interpretations that have been discussed in Brazil in relation to these artists. And yet, the concretistas were not only far from being a cohesive group, but their innovative and experimental art production is grounded in a series of paradoxes. In their Marxist goal of making art for the masses, for example, the concretistas sought to produce works that would come close to industrially produced objects, such as what we see here with Sassiloto. He was a worker at a metal factory, and that's another thing to bear in mind, because these artists did not have any market, and they had to survive by doing daytime jobs. So Sassiloto worked in a factory of metal, and that's where his proficiency with this material comes from. I mean, this particular work is really cut out from one sheet of metal. Other artists like Abraham Palacinik worked probably until very recently in a fish factory in Rio de Janeiro, while at the same time making his aparelhos cinecromáticos. As exemplified by paradigmatic works such as Luis Sassiloto's Concretion 5521 of 1955, and by Cordeiro's Visible Idea of 1956, this approach implied erasing any trace of individuality or subjectivity in favor of smooth, slick surfaces, mostly painted with air pistol over Yucatex. However, this type of orthodoxy seems to have only consolidated at the time of the initial concrete art show of 1956 and was relatively short-lived. By contrast, many of the works, such as Lothar Charouz's Abstrato Geométrico, many of the works produced by artists affiliated or favored by this group, exhibit expressive lines and surfaces that belie the active presence of the artist's hand, thereby negating the group's postulates. The debates around the issue of color that took place both in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro during this critical decade of the 50s provide a further fascinating instance of the productive persistence of referential elements in the work of the concretistas, as well as their unfolding into unsuspected areas. As I have argued elsewhere, color, which is that very common and ancient medium of art, served to divide the group along aesthetic and ideological lines. The gist of this controversy was not chromatic theory per se, but the notion of color as either a concrete, self-referential element, or a corpus solidum, in the words of Waldemar Cordeiro, who was the group's theoretician, or as an ungraspable, almost metaphysical entity or quasi-corpus, or the subject of the proposal from the point of view of Ferreira Goulart and the neo-concrete artists. On one hand, the Sao Paulo group favored an elementary spectrum and predetermined schemes involving the repetition of color bands across the picture plane a la Max Bill. The concrete, and a few years later, the neo-concrete artists of Rio, on the other hand, not only rebelled against this method, they committed treason, like Aloisio Carval said, you know, I really broke all the commandments, I committed treason, because he favored purples and greens and other colors that were not within that chromatic spectrum. They not only rebelled against this method, but proceeded to apply them in a broad range of both primary and secondary colors and hues to modulate the tonal surface of the painting and generate numerous dynamic relationships. As illustrated by Ivan Serpa's rhythmic strips of 1953, they sought to eliminate the figure background opposition, thus energizing the viewer's perception of and paving the way for his or her eventual participation in the work. In their case, color was not an object per se, but a sensorial, visual, and participatory objectification that in its immanence, suggested by an almost corporeal being, ceases to pretend it is real. In this way, the work of Serpa and the Rio Concretistas paved the way for what would become, a few years later, one of the key contributions of Neoconcretismo, a spatial conception of color exemplified by Elio Itisica's early series of spatial reliefs and nuclei. In this context, an exceptional case is provided by the concretistas' fascination with the art of Alfredo Volpi, an independent painter from Sao Paulo, almost self-taught painter from Sao Paulo, considered by both the Rio and Sao Paulo groups as the maximum exponent of concrete art in Brazil. While Volpi's visually engaging and sophisticated compositions conveyed the idea of concreteness, both their method of production and referential components situated them in an extremely idiosyncratic terrain, something that we can call a vernacular concretism. Indeed, not only were Volpi's works rendered in the ancient, say medieval medium of egg-based tempera, but many of his concrete compositions, characterized by the extraordinary melding of figure and ground, take as their point of departure the shape of the festival flags used in Brazilian religious and popular festivities, particularly the Festival of St. John's since the colonial period. Volpi's case, in turn, suggests that the process that led to what 3 decades later can be described as an innovational anachronism can only be explained in terms of a continuum of discrepancies through which the main contributions of 1950s Brazil to modernism can be read. Stated in the trenchant terms of poet Decio Pignatari, and I quote, "Our vision through concrete poetry and art consisted of a subversive approach to a culture that at the time was non-existent. Our project entailed industry and egg at the same time. That is the Brazilian contradiction. Neither here nor in Yankee land could one avoid this type of contradiction when our greatest painter, Volpi, belonged to a medieval tradition." End of quote. I would like now to go on to the Neoconcrete group, which raises a series of issues because Neoconcretismo, I think we can argue, it's not concrete. It comes out of certain postulates of concrete art, but it is really influenced by phenomenology, Suzanne Lang's theories, Merleau-Ponty, and a number of other and a number of other influences that really take it out into another area. So I think the name itself was almost like an opportunistic way of claiming attention for the group. This is something that Hector Olea has argued very extensively, while it really had nothing to do with the initial postulates, even though many of the artists, beginning with Lydia Clark, really came out of the ranks of concrete art. Insofar as these proposals were not able to ignore the new subject of these social projects, they were invariably overcome with subjectivity. Such tensions or even contradictions had a deep impact in the theory and practice of the avant-garde groups under consideration. At the artistic level, the almost overnight shift from a referential, figurative to a self-referential, non-objective plastic discourse went hand in hand with the articulation of a brand new kind of participative viewer, the subject of the impending, emerging social order. Whether grounded in a Marxist model of production, as was the case with early constructive art trends and later on with concretismo, or supported by the type of existential humanism tempered with a dose of phenomenology of perception and Gestalt theory, manifested later on by neoconcretismo, both tendencies ultimately sought the inscription and projection of subjectivity, first through the values of pure vision, such as afterimage and rationality, and later on through an immersive experience encompassing the senses, touch, gaze, and the like. Hence, in Lydia Clark's concrete works, and exemplified by the Modulated Surfaces series of 1957 to 1959, the line, first of all, is not drawn, as you cannot tell from here. It is actually cut, and it is pieces of wood that come together to create that virtual line. That line is an element. If you go to Lydia Clark's exhibition at MoMA right now, you will see that from the very beginning of her work, line is really one of the key elements of her work. And that line first goes out into the frame in her more traditional paintings. Then it becomes a line in this Modulated Surfaces series, which is a virtual line. Then it expands into space, it circumscribes, and then juts out into space, and later it serves to establish a relation between subject and object. In a similar vein, color becomes a concrete entity in Aloisio Carvalho's Cubocore of 1960, consisting of pigment on a three-dimensional block of concrete. How much more concrete can you get after that? And finally, after a long process that begins with the well-known two-dimensional Metaschema series, color takes on a body in Oiticica's Parangoles, paintings to live in, as Gerardo mentioned. Through such strategies, the neoconcrete artists in Rio sought to restore the vital, that is, the subjective, expressive, and phenomenological dimension that they considered to have been dismissed by their rationalist counterparts, while in the process generating a new subject for their proposals. In my view, this idea really comes full circle from the paradox that I tried to illustrate with Torres Garcia and his unwillingness to let go of the referential world to the inscription of the subject in the work of art. I think that's one of the key traits that characterizes all of these, the paradoxical nature of many of these tendencies in Latin America. What followed, however, is a story that we all know. The political reaction to the Cuban Revolution would transform the political map of the continent, shifting it towards military dictatorships mobilized from Washington, D.C. Beginning in 1964-65, under the threat of nuclear war and the activation of urban and rural guerrillas, a series of military coups throughout the region branded the political shift towards the hard right-wing political establishment. The result is the deactivation of the rational concrete paradigm that had stemmed from a socio-political model of developmentalism. In the artistic sphere, the shift would manifest itself in the move away from concrete art manifestations to pop, up, abstract expressionist, and informalist tendencies, as well as the emergence of conceptual practices. The examples that I just discussed embody the complexity and contradictions of concrete art manifestations in leading enclaves in South America. Yes, as I tried to demonstrate, insofar as they expanded the achievements of concrete art, central concrete art, the significance of these manifestations transcends the local context in which they have traditionally been inscribed. This situation suggests the need to start drawing a new map of these movements on the basis of transnational interactions between artists and groups. In this context, a series of artists stand out not only for the way in which their genuine production destabilized fixed categories, tendencies, genres, or movements of European concrete and constructive art. The concept I propose of an experimental hinge here is useful in that it allows us to isolate the contribution of these catalytic agents, artists that are seminal for this mini, macro, mega, or anti-Latin American stereotypical narrative, and introduce it in the most diverse artistic contexts, cultural axiologies, or genre accounts. That is, the concept allows us to identify visionary artists unclassifiable within the parameters of the hegemonic canon, at the same time that it allows us to elucidate their quite specific contribution to modernism, both here and there. These experimental hinges, in turn, function to equalize either the context or plural networks in which modernism operated, thus opening the way for a broader framework articulated around the idea of intersecting modernities. Such a framework allows us to approach these divergent artistic manifestations taking place outside of the central axis of the West in terms that eschew the traditional subordinate or marginal status with which they have been approached in the worn-out center-periphery model. The main feature of these collective or individual projects is their capacity to not only stand on an equal footing with their central counterparts, but at the same time to expand key aspects of the canonical movements, always updated from industry to design, from fashion to advertising. The artistic product that emerges from these conditions and contradictions has its own autonomy, its own internal dynamic, as well as its own specificity. I underscore here the idea of intersecting modernities, paradigms more than models, where these convergence keys come together. Amongst the resulting symbiosis, there are the contributions generated in socioeconomic and historically political unequal axes. More importantly, this is the end, my last paragraph, when measured against the formal and conceptual purity of the central manifestations, the art that results from this crisscrossing of modernities is, by definition, an impure hybrid. The notion of eclecticism, so frequently downplayed as a negative factor, is key to understanding the dynamic of experimental practitioners or forerunners at the core of these intersecting modernities. In this context of creative negativity, artists are not, for the most part, interested in formal or stylistic purity, an imported utopia, albeit in its down-to-earth inversion. That was the spirit of inverted utopias a decade ago that I can summarize today as these transnational readings. From this point of view, modern art itself becomes the reservoir of languages and strategies that the Latin American artists felt free to appropriate, assimilate, combine, or even aggressively, in some cases, regurgitate in tandem with its immediate needs, cultural milieu, and artistic limits and limitations. In sum, its reality. Moreover, from this point of view, biased and poorly considered terms such as the eclectic take on a new meaning, one linked to an actuality that involves the artist's pursuit of his or her own path, in this case, in response to his or her necessity of concreteness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the inspirational lecture.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I said it was very inspirational and also energetic, your voice, so that was really great.
Couldn't expect anything less for this time of day.
Yeah.
I could see everybody's face drooping, you know.
Yeah. So in the beginning of your talk, you laid out these exhibitions. Some of them you were involved in. They were mostly from the decade of 2000. And I wonder
They began around 1997.
1997. Okay, so I guess besides exhibition, what kind of discursive triggers did we have in the 1990s, perhaps to, in fact, feed into this wave of rediscovering? And I guess I also want to kind of know what role global conceptualism exhibition, Points of Origin 1950 to 1980, played in the larger wave of looking back into this period in South America. And my question partially comes out of not South America, but actually South Korea. So South Korean artists looked at global conceptualism exhibition that took place in 1999, and they particularly liked your essay and Peter Wallen's essay, so they translated those essays.
Never heard that.
Yeah, maybe without copyright, but
okay. Pirate translation.
Yeah, so they translated those two essays for their own use in this artist journal called Forum A in August of 2000. So Elio Oiticica and Liga Clark didn't become really household names among these leftist artists, but still they became the names that they constantly referred to. So I guess these leftist artists in South Korea were looking for a model beyond institutional critique and conceptualism, and I think they really found something in your essay. So I guess I'm thinking about different, like you said, historically and politically unequal access, and sort of temporal disparities of reception of scholarship like this. So a question.
Well, there are several things there. First of all, why these exhibitions, start to happen in the 90s? I think it has to do with this expansion and revisionism that has been taking place since the 80s in art history, as well as curatorial work. Globalization, I think, had a lot to do with that, the opening of all the circuits. Curators from the United States and start traveling, United States and Europe start traveling to Latin America and vice versa. I mean, I was part of all that. I lived that, as well as Gerardo and many of us. And so there is this, discovery of these, virgin territory, which is Latin America, which nobody had shown. So that gives way to a series of exhibitions. The first one, in terms of geometric and constructive tendencies, that shows Elio and Lilla, as well as Gego and other artists, was at LA MoCA. It was called The Experimental Exercise of Freedom, with the title borrowed from Pedrosa. So that gives way, that's one of the beginnings, but then there comes this phenomenon of the private collectors. And I think, and I'm pretty strong about this argument, that it is the private collectors who actually impose this on the table. Because these tendencies had been completely forgotten. I mean, nobody was interested in this. They had no value in the market. I mean, it was just, that was, what happened. Even when I was doing research in the 1990s in Sao Paulo, I remember important artists telling me they could not understand the whole craziness of people over Elio and Lilla, because they were just some artists from Rio. I mean, they were not the real artists, of Brazil. The Sao Paulistas were the real artists. So anyway, and so that's one part of the equation. In terms of global conceptualism, I think what happened was that what my essay brings to the fore is something similar to what I have said here, which is has been part of my work with the Latin American avant-garde in different chapters and different periods. What I've noticed in terms of what the artists, Latin America is part of the West, is part of Western tradition. I think it's wrong to say that, we're outside of that. Almost every artist from the high art tradition, which is what we're dealing with here, has been to Europe and has taken Europe and European artists as the model to start off and do things. Many times they assimilate that and then they change it, as I tried to demonstrate. And in the case of conceptualism, one of the things they did is that the whole notion of dematerialization never happened in Latin America. So what artists did was they used objects, like Cildo Meireles, with his Coca-Cola bottles. They relied on the object to carry messages because it was a time of political dictatorships. And so beginning to formulate, that mode of conceptualism in those terms, I think opened the way for artists from many other different counterparts who were not part of the original, group of conceptualists in the United States to see a model that they could use for their own use.
Okay, really quickly. Your title reminded me the way you joined abstract art that is not an abstraction. In some ways reminded me very oddly some things I've read from the Soviet sphere in the kind of post-Stalinist period, and also in Poland, but also in Yugoslavia earlier on, where it was never Stalinist, as kind of defenses for abstraction, because the main dogma would be that, according to Marxism, which is fundamentally materialist, that there is no such thing as an abstract idea. Mm-hmm. It needs to take concrete form, and this kind of almost like rhetorical acrobatics were very important in defending abstraction in the socio-political context. You already mentioned the kind of Marxist paradigm of production that operates in some of these artists. I'm wondering if there's a greater trend in this idea of concreteness. It goes back to what you said about the object, that avoiding abstraction is almost a kind of materialist thing that is aligned with very specific politics at the time. And I'm wondering if this is a political choice too.
I think in this case it was not, I mean, they're not trying to avoid abstraction, they're trying to engage it. And they're trying to be abstract because that's what they...
I mean, abstract in the sense of absence of object,
Oh, okay. Yes, but the problem, and that's what I was driving at, and that's why I used Torres Garcia, because I think that it starts there, is that they're unable to abandon that. I remember many years ago walking into a Malevich retrospective in New York and being completely surprised at a Cubist painting by Malevich that had a cow, a very literally represented cow in the middle. And I said, this is Latin America, I mean, this is what it is. They can never go to the white square. That is impossible. There's always has to be some kind of referential element, even if it's hidden, as in the case of Tomás Maldonado, which you look at it and you don't know, what the relationship is, but there is actually a figure there, even if it's in the form of a square and a rectangle and whatever. So I think that's it's an ingrained contradiction and paradox, I would say, in the way in which they assimilate these languages because they want to be modern, but at the same time they can't renounce, this other tradition that is based on representation, because they're either afraid that people are not going to understand what they're saying, or simply because it's just built into, their way of thinking.
Okay, thank you for these final words of the day, and thank you for all the panelists of the day.